Learner, it's really quite something, isn't it, that even today, a huge number of people, figures like, what, 87% in the U.S., still holds some kind of creation belief.
Yeah, it's pretty striking.
And yet, when you think about who really fundamentally shifted our view of our place in nature over the last, say, 200 years, well, Charles Darwin's name just leaps out.
Absolutely. Einstein changed how we see the universe, the cosmos, but Darwin, he, along with maybe Marx or Freud, like our sources suggest, really changed how we see ourselves.
Exactly. He gave us this scientific story for where species came from, which, well, it directly challenged the old narratives.
And captured the public imagination in a huge way. He wasn't just talking to scientists.
So, learner, that's our mission for this deep dive.
Okay.
We want to really get under the hood of Darwin's core ideas, not just, a life story,
Right.
but the actual philosophy, those big insights, and how they still echo today.
Yeah.
I will try to keep the jargon to a minimum.
And you've given us fantastic material to work with. We've got bits from Origin of Species, obviously, Descent of Man, the Beagle Voyage Journal.
And even his work on, like, emotions in animals, insect-eating plants, even earthworms.
Yeah, and his autobiography, letters, critiques. It's a really rich picture.
It lets us see him from, well, loads of different angles. Okay, so before we jump into the theory itself, maybe a quick sketch of the man born into wealth.
Yes, privileged background. But interestingly, not a star student initially.
He found medicine a bit uninspiring.
That's putting it mildly, I think. But he did find this passion for natural history. Insects, apparently, were an early obsession.
Ah, a bug enthusiast.
Seems so. And that early fascination, that keen observation, it really set the stage. Then came the big one, the HMS Beagle voyage.
5 years, 1831 to 36. That was the game changer.
Absolutely. As the ship's naturalist, he just soaked it all in, saw incredible diversity, collected countless specimens, fossils, made detailed notes. That trip provided the raw material, the data for everything that followed.
Okay, learner, let's dive into the core idea then. The theory of evolution by natural selection. At its heart, as the sources lay out, it's about survival, right? Organisms that fit their environment better, they tend to thrive.
They thrive, and crucially, they leave more offspring. Those less well-suited, they struggle more.
So over time, the traits change. The useful ones get passed on more often.
Exactly. It's a gradual process. Those beneficial genetic traits become more common in the population generation after generation.
And you can really see the beagle's influence here. Those Galapagos observations, the finches, the tortoises.
Finches' beaks, yeah, adapted for different seeds on different islands. Classic example.
It showed variation wasn't just random noise, it was linked to the environment. And the fossils he found hinted at change over time, what he called descent with modification.
Right. Species weren't fixed. They descended from earlier forms, but with changes. The key, learner, was seeing how these variations, especially on isolated islands, really showed the power of local conditions shaping life.
And it wasn't just his own observations feeding into this, was it? He was reading other thinkers. Lyell's geology book seems huge here.
Hugely influential. Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. Lyell argued for uniformitarianism.
Which is the idea that what we see happening now, geologically speaking.
Yeah, like erosion, volcanoes, earthquakes. Those same slow, steady processes have been shaping the Earth for, well, an incredibly long time. The present is the key to the past.
And that gave Darwin the time frame he needed, right? Because natural selection wouldn't work overnight.
Precisely. He needed deep time for these slow, gradual changes to accumulate and produce the diversity of life he was seeing, both living and in the fossil record. Lyell provided the geological context for that vast timescale.
Okay, so you have variation, you have deep time, and then there's the idea of connection. Common ancestry.
Yes. Darwin started noticing striking similarities in the basic structure, the morphology of different creatures. Think of the bones in a human hand, a bat's wing, a whale's flipper.
Similar underlying patterns, even if they're used for different things.
Exactly. He traced these similarities, these homologies, across plants and animals, and it led him to propose that life wasn't a series of separate creations, but more like a branching tree. All species ultimately connected back to common ancestors.
Which was, well, pretty radical for the time.
Oh, absolutely. The dominant view was fixed species, created as they are. Darwin was proposing this dynamic, interconnected history of life.
Okay, learner, now here's a really key point. Darwin had this powerful explanation, natural selection, for how species could change. But he didn't actually know how traits were passed down. the mechanism was missing.
That's a critical piece. He could see the results, the adaptations, but the mechanics of inheritance were a mystery. Our sources mention he even flirted with ideas like Lamarckism.
The idea you could pass on traits you acquired during your life, like a giraffe stretching its neck.
Right, but he knew that didn't quite fit the bill. He even came up with his own complex idea called pangenesis, with these little particles called gemmules.
Which didn't pan out, biologically speaking.
No, but it shows how intensely he grappled with the problem. He knew inheritance was key, but he lacked the scientific understanding of how it worked.
And the answer was actually being worked out around the same time, wasn't it? Gregor Mendel and his P's.
Exactly. Mendel was figuring out the basic laws of genetics, how traits are passed down in predictable ways through discrete units, what we now call genes.
But Darwin never knew about it.
Astonishingly, no. They were contemporaries, but Mendel published in a fairly obscure journal, and his work just wasn't widely recognized until decades later. Imagine if Darwin had read Mendel.
Wow. Yeah, one of science's great what-if moments.
It really is. Mendel provided the missing piece, the mechanism for reliable inheritance that natural selection could act upon.
So it wasn't until, the late 1890s, early 1900s that Mendel's work was rediscovered.
That's right. And then scientists started putting Darwin's natural selection together with Mendelian genetics. That became the modern synthesis.
Which is pretty much the foundation of modern evolutionary biology. And later discoveries like DNA structure, the Human Genome Project, they just added more detail and confirmation.
Precisely. The modern synthesis combined the variation arising from genetic mutation, with the how natural selection sorting those variations, a really powerful, comprehensive framework.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit, learner, to something more uncomfortable. The sources make it clear that Darwin's ideas were sometimes, twisted and misused.
Yes, this is really important to tackle, particularly the phrase survival of the fittest.
Which wasn't even Darwin's originally, right? It was Herbert Spencer.
Correct. Darwin adopted it later, perhaps finding it useful shorthand. But Spencer and others took that concept and ran with it in directions Darwin never intended.
Applying it to human societies.
Exactly. Social Darwinism. Using evolutionary ideas to justify social inequalities, imperialism, laissez-faire capitalism. Basically saying the ruling powerful were fitter and deserved to be on top, while the poor or colonized peoples were somehow less fit.
And this led to some really dark places, like eugenics.
Indeed. Darwin's own cousin, Francis Galton, coined that term. The idea was to improve the human race by selective breeding, encouraging the fit to reproduce, and discouraging, or even forcibly preventing, the unfit from doing so.
The material mentions forced sterilizations happening in places like the U.S.
Yes, sadly. And it reached its horrifying peak with the Nazi regime in Germany, whose ideology was steeped in these twisted eugenic and racial ideas.
It's absolutely crucial, as the sources stress, learner, to understand these were distortions, misapplications, not what Darwin himself was arguing for in his scientific work.
Cannot stress that enough. Darwin's theory explains biological diversity. It's not a social or political manifesto. The horrific misuse of his ideas is a sobering lesson about the ethical responsibility that comes with scientific knowledge.
Okay, let's turn to the descent of man. Here, Darwin explicitly applies his theory to us, to humans.
He does. He argues pretty directly that humans share a common ancestor with other apes, specifically mentioning chimpanzees. This was a direct challenge to the Genesis creation story.
And the implications were massive.
Huge! It fundamentally challenged the idea that humans were somehow separate from or above the rest of nature. It also brought things like the mind, consciousness, morality, previously maybe philosophical or religious topics, into the scope of scientific investigation.
Which naturally created friction, right? Science versus faith.
A major tension, absolutely. The sources highlight this debate is still very much alive. And even back then, some who respected science worried that a purely evolutionary view might, reduce human experience, miss the spiritual or existential side.
That tension is palpable in the reactions at the time. Suggesting we evolved from apes wasn't exactly popular in many circles?
No, it certainly wasn't. It struck at the heart of deeply held beliefs about human exceptionalism and our relationship with the divine.
But Darwin went beyond just our physical origins in Descent of Man. The sources point to his observations on emotions.
Yes, he argued that the basic emotions, joy, fear, anger, pain, even curiosity, jealousy, the ability to dream, weren't uniquely human. He saw strong parallels in other animals, especially mammals.
Trying to show there wasn't this unbridgeable gap in mental life between us and, say, dogs or apes.
Precisely. He meticulously documented how emotions are expressed physically, noting similarities across species. He saw this as evidence of a shared evolutionary heritage for our emotional systems, too.
And he tackled morality as well, social instincts, sympathy.
He did. He proposed that instincts like cooperation, empathy, parental care, these would be favored by natural selection in social animals because they help the group survive.
So morality, in his view, grew out of these basic social instincts combined with our higher intelligence.
That was his argument. He saw sympathy expanding outwards from family to tribe to nation, and eventually he noted, perhaps even to animals, though he saw that as a later, more refined development.
Now, the material also brings up something interesting. Darwin apparently observed that civilization, by caring for the sick and weak, might actually hinder natural selection in humans.
Yes, he did wrestle with that. He noted that in nature, weaker individuals often perish, but in human societies, we actively protect them through medicine, charity, social support. He pondered if this might lead to a propagation of weaker constitutions over time.
But he wasn't advocating we stop caring for people, was he?
No, not at all. He immediately followed that observation by stressing the absolute importance of sympathy as our noblest part. He recognized the immense moral cost of suppressing compassion. It was a tension, he observed, an ethical dilemma posed by civilization rather than a prescription for action. He also noted weaker individuals often had fewer children anyway, creating a kind of check.
Okay, now this next part requires careful handling, learner. The sources indicate that in The Descent of Man, Darwin did discuss differences between what were then considered human races.
Yes, reflecting the anthropological thinking of his era, he did observe and report on perceived physical and mental differences between various human populations.
But it's crucial to add, and the sources emphasize this, he also strongly argued for a common ancestry for all humans. He noted similarities in structure, mental faculties, and susceptibility to diseases, pointing to inheritance from a single progenitor. He explicitly stated no single trait was unique to any one race.
That's a critical clarification. While he documented perceived differences, his overarching argument was for the fundamental unity and shared origin of humankind, placing all races within a single species, Homo sapiens. His framework actually undermined the polygenist view that different races had separate origins, which was common then.
Similarly, the sources mention his discussion of differences between the sexes.
He did observe that, in his time, men seemed to achieve greater eminence in fields like science, art, and philosophy. He attributed this partly to the pressures of competition and struggle faced by males throughout evolutionary history, but also potentially to societal factors.
Did he think this was fixed?
Interestingly, no. The sources note he suggested women could reach the same standard if given the same education and opportunities as men. So he left the door open for societal influence playing a significant role. Again, reflecting the views of his time, but with nuances.
Okay, shifting back to the core theory. One big objection Darwin faced was the fossil record. Where were all the intermediate forms, the missing links?
Right. If evolution happened gradually, shouldn't the rocks be full of transitional fossils? Darwin tackled this head-on.
His argument was basically, the record is terrible.
Essentially, yes. He stressed the extreme imperfection of the geological record. Think about it. Only a tiny fraction of organisms ever fossilize. Conditions have to be just right.
And we'd only explored a tiny fraction of the Earth's rocks back then.
Exactly. Plus, fossilization favors hard parts like bones and shells. Soft-bodied creatures leave little trace. And there are huge gaps in time between different rock layers. So, he argued, the absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence.
He expected these innumerable intermediate varieties must have existed, but finding them would be rare.
Yes, and he also argued that natural selection itself would tend to eliminate the intermediate forms as newer, better adapted versions arose, making them less likely to persist and fossilize in large numbers.
So the gaps were understandable, given the nature of fossilization in geological time.
That was his counter. And he pointed to finds like Archaeopteryx, the fossil with feathers like a bird, but teeth and a tail like a reptile, as exactly the kind of transitional form his theory predicted, however rare they might be to find.
The sources also mention he grappled with other challenges, like complex organs. The eye is the classic example. How could that evolve step by step?
He acknowledged it seemed, quote, absurd in the highest degree at first glance, but then he methodically laid out how even a simple light-sensitive spot gives an advantage.
And from there, slight improvements. A lens forming, muscles to focus, each step providing a benefit.
Exactly. He argued that through countless small, useful variations preserved and accumulated by natural selection over immense time, something as complex as the vertebrate eye could indeed evolve gradually. It didn't need to appear fully formed all at once.
Okay, learner, let's look at Darwin the person again, specifically his views on religion. The sources, especially his autobiography and letters, paint a picture of someone losing their faith over time.
Yes, it was a gradual process. He started out quite conventionally religious, even considering a career in the church at one point. He initially believed in the literal truth of the Bible.
But his scientific work started to clash with that.
Increasingly so. His discoveries about evolution, the age of the Earth, the mechanisms of natural selection, they offered explanations for things previously attributed to divine creation. And he found it hard to reconcile the Bible's account with scientific evidence, eventually seeing it as no more historically reliable than other ancient religious texts.
The material mentions his critique of Paley's argument from Design the Watchmaker analogy.
Right. Paley argued that finding a complex object, like a watch, implies a watchmaker. Similarly, the complexity of nature implies a divine designer. Darwin countered that natural selection itself could produce that complexity, that apparent design, without needing a supernatural designer.
It was a natural explanation for complexity.
Exactly, a non-miraculous mechanism. He also, as the sources highlight, really struggled with the problem of suffering.
The sheer amount of pain and death in nature.
Yes. He found it incredibly difficult to square that reality, predators, disease, parasites, natural disasters with the idea of an all-powerful, all-loving God. How could a benevolent creator permit such widespread suffering? It deeply troubled him.
Which ultimately led him towards agnosticism.
Yes. He concluded that the ultimate questions about origins, about God, were likely beyond the grasp of the human intellect, as he put it. He felt he simply didn't have the evidence to affirm or deny God's existence, so he identified as agnostic.
Although, interestingly, his wife, Emma, who remained religious, apparently felt his theory could be compatible with belief in God.
That's a fascinating point from the sources, yes. Emma's note suggests that for her, and perhaps for Charles in some ways, depending on how one defined God, evolution didn't necessarily preclude faith. It highlights the personal and varied ways people reconcile science and religion, even within the same family.
And despite losing traditional faith, he still seemed to hold some hope for humanity's future.
It seems so. While grappling with the vastness of geological time and the idea of eventual cosmic oblivion, he still expressed a kind of faith in progress, in humanity's capacity to improve, driven by both biological and cultural forces.
Okay, finally, learner, let's touch on Darwin's own reflections about how he worked as a scientist. The sources really emphasize the impact of the Beagle voyage, obviously, but also his method.
Absolutely. He valued that hands-on experience immensely. But he was also incredibly methodical, working on true Baconian principles, he said, meaning gathering vast amounts of facts before daring to theorize.
And that famous eureka moment reading Malthus on population.
Yes. Malthus wrote about how populations tend to grow faster than their food supply, leading to a struggle for existence. That sparked Darwin's insight. This struggle could be the engine driving natural selection, favoring those with advantageous traits.
And I love that golden rule the sources mention.
Yes. Always immediately write down any observation or thought that seemed to contradict his theories.
That takes real discipline. Shows a commitment to challenging his own ideas.
Incredible intellectual honesty. He knew how easy it is to forget inconvenient facts. He actively sought out counter-evidence.
He also saw the value in communicating science broadly, didn't he?
Yeah.
Not just publishing dense papers.
Definitely. He wrote accessible books like Origin of Species, precisely because he wanted his ideas to reach beyond just specialists. He understood the importance of popular science.
And he had a pretty clear view of his own strengths. A good observer, capable of sustained reasoning. He saw origin as one long argument.
Which it is, a masterfully constructed argument built on mountains of evidence. He was also crucially willing to change his mind.
The sources say he was constantly revising his hypotheses.
Yes, he emphasized keeping his mind free, being ready to abandon a cherished idea if the facts went against it. He admitted many of his initial guesses were wrong or needed modification. That flexibility is key to good science.
I like the analogy he used about his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin.
Oh, right. That Erasmus had sort of pointed the way, suggested evolution was happening, but he, Charles, had found the mechanism of natural selection, the way to actually read the map of life.
It acknowledges his intellectual debts while highlighting his own massive contribution.
Exactly. And then, of course, that famous, almost poetic ending to Origin of Species,
There is grandeur in this view of life.
with its several powers having been originally breathed, and then in later editions he added, by the Creator,
into a few forms or into one. And that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. It's beautiful.
It really captures his sense of awe at the evolutionary process. The addition of by the Creator is interesting, maybe a nod to prevailing views, maybe reflecting his own complex feelings.
And his curiosity didn't stop with the big picture. The sources mention his book on earthworms.
Yes, the formation of vegetable mold through the action of worms, spending years studying worms.
It shows his dedication to observation, even of the seemingly small things, and he found they have a huge impact, right?
Massive impact on soil turnover and fertility. He even commented on their surprising intelligence and how they plug their burrows. It led to that great quote, "De minimis lex non curat." The law doesn't sweat the small stuff is not applicable to science. Everything matters.
And finally, the sources remind us of his strong feelings about slavery.
Yes, his experience on the Beagle, particularly in Brazil, instilled in him a fierce hatred of slavery. His writings and letters are very clear on his moral outrage.
It adds another dimension to the man. And we even get little personal things, like hating barnacles, despite studying them for years.
Huh. Yes, 8 years on barnacles. A love-hate relationship, perhaps. And that quote about evolution being too deep for the human intellect, like a dog pondering Newton's mind, it shows his humility.
It really rounds out the picture.
These details show the human behind the science, the empathy, the curiosity, the occasional frustration, the profound humility.
So, learner, to wrap up, the big takeaway here is pretty clear. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection wasn't just another scientific idea, it was revolutionary.
Built on painstaking work, yes, but powered by this transformative insight that fundamentally changed how we understand life's diversity and our own origins within that web.
It kicked off a scientific earthquake, really, and the aftershocks, the discussions and debates are still felt today, as we've touched on.
Absolutely. And this deep dive, well, it's really just skimming the surface. Darwin's work is vast, touching on biology, geology, psychology, botany. His influence is immense.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, learner. Think about Darwin's own journey. His changing views on science and faith, his grappling with tough ethical questions arising from his work, and that deep sense of humility he seemed to have before the complexity of nature.
What questions does that raise for us now? How do we navigate the relationship between scientific understanding and our values, our sense of meaning, our place in the universe?
Definitely something to ponder. And if this has sparked your interest, there's so much more to explore.
Absolutely. Read Darwin himself, Origin, Descent, Voyage of the Beagle. Look into the history of genetics, the modern synthesis. Explore the ongoing conversations about evolution today.
Because learning, much like evolution itself, well, it's a continuous journey, isn't it?
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.